Once upon a time there was a law which allowed people to enslave the poor ones, to enslave others just because they had a different skin color. Slavery shows us the dark side of humans. In this video we will go through the whole history of slavery since the ancient to our modern 21st century. Yes, until the 21st century. Unfortunately, slavery still exists today in different forms. Hi guys, this is Prateek and you are watching Eclectic. This video was made possible with the help of RestavekFreedom.org, an organization which aims to end child slavery in Haiti. The origins of the slavery. The precise beginning of the slavery is difficult to track because specific written records are very difficult to find. Due to the sociological makeup of the groups, we know that slavery was not a part of hunter-gatherer societies. So the first identifiable evidence of slavery comes from the Code of Hammurabi out of Mesopotamia. The Code of Hammurabi is a well-preserved Babylonian code of law of ancient Mesopotamia, dated back to about 1700 BCE. It is one of the oldest deciphered writings of significant length in the world. The 6th Babylonian king Hammurabi enacted this code. This ancient text refers to slavery as a common practice throughout the region which had been in place for thousands of years at the time of it was written. Slavery throughout the ancient world. The practice of human slavery grew as the world became more civilized and organized cities and farms were developed. Ancient Sumer or Sumeria is still considered to be the birthplace of slavery. Slavery grew out of Sumer into Greece and other parts of ancient Mesopotamia. The ancient East, specifically China and India, did not adopt the practice of slavery until much later, as late as Qin dynasty in 221 BC. Historians debate whether or not the practice of slavery in India existed before this time. Most of the historians believe that the slavery did not exist in ancient India, as there is no word in ancient Sanskrit that can be translated as slave. The life of a slave in ancient times. Slavery in ancient times rapidly came about as a result of debt, birth into slave family, child abandonment, war, or as a punishment for crime. In the ancient period, the slave trade was not very popular and was certainly not a booming global business. Rather, slavers would often seek out a buyer who could use the specific skills of a slave, matching supply with demand on a local and personal level. According to historical texts, the lives of slaves in ancient times were typically better than that of peasants and agricultural laborers in the same era, because slaves had regular care, food, shelter and clothing, and peasants had not. Slaves rarely attempted to run away unless their masters were cruel. Slavery in the Middle Ages. Throughout the Middle Ages, the practice of slavery changed dramatically as global warfare, raiding and conquering spanned across continents. This led to chaos and confusion as the citizens of conquered regions were taken as slaves and transported across many miles to work as slaves for their captors. Medieval slavery in Europe. King Charlemagne is responsible for uniting large parts of West and Central Europe at the outset of the Middle Ages. This unification was brought through war and violence, and many of his campaigns involved taking slaves and selling them to highest bidders. Under the reign of King Charlemagne, European slaves became more popular throughout the Muslim countries, marking the true beginning of the global slave trade. Throughout this period in history, Vikings were also taking slaves across Europe, concentrating them heavily on the British Isles. Additionally, Spain and Portugal were in almost constant state of holy war between Muslim and Christians, leading to many women and children being taken into slavery in the name of God or Allah. Medieval slavery in Asia. Throughout the Middle Ages, slavery was growing in Asia as the Islamic invasion of India resulted in the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of Indians. One historical record shows that in the year 1001, the armies of Muhammad Ghazi conquered Peshawar and captured and enslaved roughly 1 lakh children and young people. During the same period in China, documents show that royals from Tang dynasty purchased many European and Jewish slaves. The soldiers and pirates who served the Tang dynasty also took countless slaves in raids on Korea, Turkey, Persia and Indonesia, as well as thousands of slaves taken from indigenous aboriginal tribes. Slavery in the Americas. The story of American slave trade is the first chapter in the history of slavery where most of us already have some familiarity, whether it be from graphic films on the transportation of Africans boarding slave ships or your high school American history class. Most adults are aware of the origins of slavery in the United States. The origins of American slavery. The first slaves were brought to America in 1619, when 20 men from Africa were brought to Jamestown, Virginia. Roughly 60 years later, via the Royal African Slave Company, records show that the slave trade was booming in the British colonies, and many colonists began to acquire slaves in larger numbers. Evidence suggests that the main reason for this dramatic increase was a sharp decline in the availability of servants who are bound by the contracts. In America, the majority of African slaves were concentrated in the Caribbean region to work on plantations. European colonies were dependent on African slaves on the islands to produce their sugar and coffee. The journey from Africa to the Americas was a horror that many did not survive. The ships were tightly packed, low on food, and without proper sanitation. This led to a rapid spread in fatal diseases such as dysentery, fever, and smallpox, killing both the Africans and the ship's crew. Death was a commonplace in the slave trade, and when a man or a woman passed away, their bodies were simply tossed into the ocean. This was an additional shock for the Africans, as they believed that the death and burial should be handled with care and honor. Depending on the origin and final destination of the slave ship, the journey could take anywhere from 3 weeks to several months. Records estimate that between 10 and 20 million Africans were brought to the Americas in this inhuman fashion. Although many were cast into the ocean along the way, it was a tragedy too horrifying to wrap your mind around. The abolitionist movement. Slavery is an appealing practice that has existed since the origins of human history. Although at many points in history, liberators have worked to free specific groups of people, but the abolitionist movement was different, as it aimed to put an end to slavery as a practice. The roots of the abolitionists. Some of the first countries to abolish the practice of slavery were located in Western Europe around 1500. Many European countries were careful in not using slavery in their homelands, but they relied heavily on slaves to build their empires abroad. The next step in the abolitionist movement was the ending of the slave trade globally. Slavers who were caught transporting slaves across the oceans were tried in court. However, there were still large number of slavers already in place in the Americas, and the profitability of the work slaves provided made them valuable commodity to their owners. The American Civil War. At the time of the American Civil War, there were more than 4 million slaves working in the United States, 95% of whom were in the southern states. The major political issue leading up the beginning of the Civil War was the expansion of slavery to the West. Northern abolitionists believed that if they could stop the spread of slavery, they could end the practice altogether. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidency, and the southern states left the Union shortly and formed the Confederacy. The Confederate States of America were centered around the preservation of slavery, while the Northern Union was focused on preserving the country as well as bringing an end to slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation and beyond. With the stroke of a pen, President Lincoln changed the war by signing the Emancipation Proclamation, changing the status of all enslaved Africans from bondage to freedom. This meant, although slaves were still working throughout the South region, if they could escape to the North, they would be legally free. Many slaves were able to escape to northern states using the underground railroads. In 1865, the Union regained control of the Confederate States, and the slaves in those areas were formally freed. Many of the free slaves joined the American Army and Navy to ensure their free status. Although legally free, the lives of black Americans did not immediately improve. The battle for racial inequality is one that is still ongoing in the United States, which is a reminder of our dark past. And that brings us to modern day slavery. Sadly, even after the hard work of many prominent leaders like Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and many others like them, the end of slavery did not come in the 19th century. Modern or contemporary slavery still exists across the globe, often in places you wouldn't expect. Experts estimate that there are roughly 40.3 million enslaved people currently in bondage. So what does 21st century modern slavery look like? There are many forms of modern day slavery, all of which involve people being forced to work against their will. This can take the form of prostitution, physical bondage, forced labor, human trafficking, debt bondage, or simply being born into slavery. Researchers estimate that worldwide these numbers break down to 25 million in forced labor, 15.4 million in forced marriages, 4.8 million sexual exploitations, and more than 10 million child slaves. The most weak and vulnerable among us are always the most likely to become enslaved. Women and children are often forced into slavery against their will because they have no other options or resources to live or to fight back. Other times, migrants and refugees are sold into slavery when seeking asylum, as is currently the case with thousands of Rohingya Muslims currently working in the Thai fishing industry. Research from the Global Slavery Index shows that the North Korea, Uzbekistan, Cambodia, India, and Qatar have the highest percentage of slavery among their population. In North Korea, roughly 4.37% of the population is enslaved. Most of these by the North Korean government, who forced them into slavery, even selling them to work abroad in Russia, China, and even in the United States. In India, modern day slavery often involves debt bondage, where individuals are forced into slavery to pay off debt, either their own or from previous generations. We need more people to come forward. We need to spread this message to as many as people as we can. One way you can help stop modern slavery is by knowing and understanding the signs. For example, if a person cannot leave their job, reports low wages, they may be victims of slavery. For children, look for lack of access to education, poor nutrition, shabby clothing, and lack of playtime. If you notice children's beds or clothing in factories or businesses where they don't belong, this is an indicator of child slavery. If you recognize any of these signs, call the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-7888 to report it. Thank you all for watching. See you soon.